Determinism has existed as a concept since before Socrates, with philosophers like Heraclitus arguing that all things come into being by conflict of opposites, and the sum of things flows like a stream. This essentially means that every effect has a cause, and that if you could measure all the things in the universe, you could determine the entire course of history. This idea took many different forms throughout the years, but it rarely ever appeals on a large scale in its most absolute form. I believe this is largely due to the implications that come with it, mainly that if all is already determined, then we logically would not have free will. And if we don't have free will, then how can someone be responsible for actions that they could never change? This leads to the fear of moral nihilism. I will be touching on this in a future video. But first, I need to lay the groundwork with determinism itself. What is determinism? It doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to be able to determine something. It merely means that the universe itself is determined, independent of measurement. This means there is no room for randomness or probabilities. Everything that has happened had a 100% probability of happening before it occurred. Randomness and probabilities are ultimately an illusion, born out of a lack of knowledge about the world and an inability of our minds to calculate everything on the fly. Probabilities are just a way for humans to estimate what we can't fully see. An apparent randomness is merely a statement that we are blind on the matter. Now you may ask, how can there be 100% probability for everything that happens with absolutely no exceptions? Simple. Through the law of causation. Every effect has a cause. This cannot be and has never been rationally denied. If you look at the larger chain of cause and effect, you will see that every cause is itself an effect of a previous cause, and that every effect will invariably cause other effects. This law alone leaves no room for an undetermined variable, as all variables have causes and effects. Thus, given the knowledge of all the causes and effects of the universe, you can predict with 100% probability all of the future causes and effects, as there are no exceptions to the law of causation. Some may point to computer randomness and say that this is evidence that there are exceptions. The problem with this is that it's not actually random. Most computer randomness is based on algorithms with replicatable outcomes. The ones that don't use algorithms use various techniques of true randomness, which again isn't actually random. Basically, true randomness is based on things involving hardware rather than software, such as determining the outcome based on the precise moment you press the key, the particular measurement of noise in and around the hardware, or even whether radioactive decay occurs in a monitored atom. All of these methods have causes that determine the effect of the simulated randomness. This means that the law of causation holds even when you take computers into account. Presented with these arguments, some may say, well, okay, I can see how the physical world is determined, but how can you predict the actions of living beings, particularly those of high intelligence, such as humans, that interact with the physical world and change it? Aren't we able to contemplate and make decisions? Which brings us to the discussion of free will. Determinism and free will are inextricably entangled with each other. Now there is, of course, compatibilism, which believes that determinism and free will are compatible with each other. However, this assumes either soft determinism, an entirely self-refuting philosophy that makes no goddamn sense, or logical determinism, which does not actually believe that the universe is determined. Neither of these philosophies actually believes in determinism, so I will not be going over them, as they are entirely tangential to the topic at hand. Needless to say, I take the incompatibilist perspective on this topic and will be arguing against free will. You do, in fact, make decisions in your daily life, change your mind, and contemplate future actions. But you should really ask, what is you? In this context, you are your programmed mind, programmed through your biology and the environment around you. All living beings are a product of this combination of nature and nurture. It is far easier to see the programming of less intelligent creatures as they have easily identifiable patterns to their behavior. Humans have these patterns as well, just more complex and varied, which makes it more difficult for us to see our own programming. But we are ultimately programmed. Starting at birth, your programming consists entirely of your biology, which you do not have control over. Once you enter the world, the combination of your biology, which you don't control, and the immediate environment around you, that you also don't have control over, elicits a response from you. Usually this is just screaming and crying, and you do not have control over this, as you are programmed to do so by factors that you do not control. The world then reacts based on its programming, and you will react again based on the previous programming, your biology, and the new programming of the environment's response. This cycle then repeats itself over and over again throughout the entirety of your life. There is no point in this cycle where you could possibly be free of programming. This makes it impossible to have free will, as your programming determines your will. Now, this process is obviously more complicated than I've illustrated. The world doesn't wait for your response to follow up with its response. You and the environment are not necessarily responding solely to each other, and programming is constantly happening even when you are acting, which is technically all the time. But that's what an illustration is, a rough and easy way of communicating an idea. Now you might say, that seems logical, but how could a program be capable of such complex things, like emotion, significant introspection, or in-depth decision-making and contemplation? The idea is that these are determined through complex algorithms that are the result of your programming. Say you're deciding between two things. Something led to your initial thought. Perhaps it's a simple association in your subconscious mind, but something did lead to it. Your mind will process that thought, which will lead to another thought, and another, and another. How you process things in your mind is determined by your programming. These thoughts, combined with how you process them, will deterministically lead to your conclusion, as you do not control either of those components. As for emotion, something triggers a response based on your programming, and chemicals in your body and brain makes it feel like something more than it actually is. There are two major arguments against determinism that aren't terrible. One involves quantum mechanics, and the other involves something that we don't really know that much about, sentience. Let's start with the quantum argument. But before we do, full disclosure, I am not a physicist. This is merely a layman's understanding of the topic, after quite a bit of research. Quantum superposition is when an atom is in two different states at the same time, being both excited and not excited simultaneously. There are other forms of this, where the atom is in two different positions at once, but let's focus on the first example for simplicity. So, when you observe an atom, it can be either excited, not excited, or both at the same time. Unfortunately, when measured, it appears to be only one or the other regardless of whether it is in a state of superposition or not. This led to some attempting to measure the probability of the state and position of an atom. Of course, introducing probability into the mathematics of reality itself implies that the world is indeterministic and based on probabilities rather than objective outcomes. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that we have the ability to measure everything, and that if we can't see something empirically, we should disregard deductive evidence. In this way, such theories somewhat deny the concept of quantum superposition, by saying that the particle still has to be in one state and position at any given time. But the entire basis for probabilistic outcomes is predicated on the idea that certain particles are in a state of superposition, because otherwise there would be no need for probabilities to determine a particle's state and position. In short, the theory is simply self-refuting. Such theories, I should note, are interpretations of what is known as the Born rule. However, the Born rule simply measures the probability of finding a particle in a particular state and position when measured, meaning it is a measuring tool for predicting measurements. not a measurement of reality itself. This should not be confused with the distorted interpretations that I just went over, as the Born rule, contrary to popular opinion, is not inherently indeterministic. To illustrate this concept in simpler terms, let's look at a thought experiment called Schrödinger's cat. In the experiment, you put a cat in a box along with a device that measures the state of an atom. Should the atom be excited, the device would release cyanide gas into the box, killing the cat. Should it be not excited, the gas is not released and the cat survives. Now suppose the atom is in a state of superposition, being both excited and not excited at the same time. The thought experiment says that this would mean that the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, but when you release the lid, the cat appears either alive or dead, not both obviously. How can this be possible, you may ask? Well, it's not literal, because the only way for it to work is with parallel worlds, or parallel realities, where in one reality the cat is alive and in the other it is dead. In this sense, a particle in the state of superposition is really two particles overlapping, as two parallel realities overlap themselves. I understand this sounds a little out there and weird, but this is actually a fairly well-known quantum theory called the many-worlds interpretation. This interpretation shows that things still objectively happen. It's just that more than one thing happens at any given moment, with different things happening in different realities, which ultimately maintains the law of cause and effect. This is of course contrasted with the Copenhagen interpretation, as well as several others. However, many of these theories believe that the empirical measurement of quantum superposition is more real than the principle of it, which itself shows that the measurements are faulty. If you want to learn more about this topic, I suggest you check out Derek Muller's video on the topic. He does a great job of explaining the science behind it all, and he has a great discussion at the end of it. The link is in the description. The second major argument against determinism is about sentience. What is it, and how does it factor into the issue of free will? First off, some argue that between nature and nurture, sentience is a third factor, presumably what enables free will. But all we know about sentience so far is that it is what allows us to experience sensation through our body, and mind, which itself is manifested through the body. This means that your essence essentially is experience itself. Though that still begs the question, why am I sentient in this body and not in someone else's, or something else's body? And why at this point at this time in history, and not at some point in the past or in the future? These are questions that we cannot answer, and won't be able to answer for a very long time. This makes the rest of the conversation on the topic entirely speculative. But of course, many of us like to speculate, so why don't we look into it a bit further? Let's say sentience is a third factor. Do you have control over it? If not, how is it any different from nature, something innate that you cannot control? Or how is it different from nurture, if you believe in the literal interpretation of reincarnation, where the reincarnated soul was influenced in its previous life by elements it also cannot control, its environment? On the other hand, if you claim that you do have control over your sentience, even though you presumably are your sentience, that brings up some major questions. First of all, are you your sentience? If not, then sentience is a third party to you, making it either nature or nurture, as I just went over. If, however, you are your sentience, then we should further ask, how can a thing, such as a soul or essence, influence its own intrinsic nature? Its influence intent has to come from somewhere, and it does have to have an intent in this instance, as you are arguing that it is the source of free will. If that intent is influenced by some external factor, such as nature or nurture of the body, then it is determined by such along with its current innate nature. If, however, it is not influenced by external factors, then it still has its current innate nature that would then be what determines its intent. So in any situation that you could conceive of, you still end up with a determined result. Of course, we don't have all the answers, but all of the empirical evidence and deductive reasoning point in the direction of determinism. Despite the arguments that I just went over being the least inviolable of the arguments against determinism, they are almost never used. The most popular ones just so happen to be the ones that are terrible and may not even be made in good faith. I know that may seem harsh, but it'll become clear that none of them have anything to do with whether the universe is determined or not. This is notably clear with the first argument being about ethos, character, rather than logos, logic. This is often referred to as the self-refuting argument. Basically, it states that if free will is an illusion and everything is determined, then you coming to such a conclusion is determined, thus making such a claim illegitimate as you cannot have come to any other conclusion. It goes on to say that if you do have free will, then your claim would be legitimate, as you could have come to other conclusions, but false because you were able to do so. Why would it be illegitimate to come to a determined conclusion? Because you cannot claim to have rationally deliberated in your mind to come to this conclusion if you were determined to do so from the beginning. The first problem with this argument is that determinism includes rational deliberation and the belief in determinism as being determined. Thus, there is no contradiction. The rational deliberation process is programmed into your mind through nature and nurture, as I went over previously. And yes, my belief in determinism is also determined. I think that was pretty clear from the start. The second problem is that this is a character argument that has absolutely nothing to do with whether the universe is determined or not. It is merely arguing that you can't argue in favor of determinism legitimately. This is actually the most common argument against determinism, even though it doesn't even argue against the concept of determinism itself. Retrospective determinism is a type of fallacy, and on its own, it's a fairly normal view. The fallacious statement is that because something happened under some circumstances, it was therefore bound to happen due to those circumstances. This is a very useful fallacy in assessing history, as it cherry-picks elements of a circumstance without taking everything into account. For example, some say that Julius Caesar's assassination was inevitable when he took power from the Senate, but there is many conceivable outcomes where he takes power and isn't killed, should things have occurred differently. However, indeterminists take this a step further by arguing that the principle means that it's fallacious even when you take all the circumstances into account, including microscopic details that we can't measure. This is obviously misconstruing the principle to latch on to a more popular idea. This is not what retrospective determinism means, and it is not inherently indeterministic. This argument is basically saying that because we can't determine something with 100% certainty, that is evidence that the universe itself is probabilistic. This is utterly fallacious. If a tree falls on a forest and there is no one around to hear it, the tree still makes a sound. Whether we see something or not is irrelevant to whether it exists or not. And probability, when it comes down to it, is merely a statement as to how accurate our sight is. If we were omniscient, the only two probabilities would be 0 and 100%, in which case we wouldn't say that the universe is probabilistic, as everything that happens is guaranteed to happen. Common sense is not a logical basis for an argument. It is simply saying that the logic is too complicated, so let's revert to our standard way of thinking and go with what's obvious to that mindset. The problem is that mindset is a preconditioned logic, meaning your common sense may be different from someone else's, as they were conditioned with a different logic. On a side note, much of comedy tends to be predicated on common sense, which invariably makes it unfunny to those with different logic. Comedians in this way restrict people's minds to what they already assume, rather than expand it to greater understanding. Perhaps keep this in mind the next time you laugh at something you find absurd. It's okay to indulge in comedy to have a good time, but if it gets in the way of rational thought outside of such indulgences, it becomes a problem. The morality argument is doing philosophy backwards. It states that if everything is determined and no one has free will, then there is no objective basis for morality. Just so we're clear here, the argument is saying that because of its philosophically inconvenient conclusion, determinism is therefore false. The proponents of this objection often bring up what it would mean for society and all, but again, none of this has anything to do with disproving determinism itself. It's just complaining about its perceived conclusions. This is arguing backwards and isn't relevant to the conversation. I understand that the perceived moral implications for this makes many people uncomfortable, which is why I'll be going over these implications in the next video.